You're about to have a thought. You didn't schedule it, you didn't decide to have it, it will simply appear, and then you'll claim you thought it. That's the thing I want to examine, because the claim, I thought it, implies an I that was prior to the thought, that generated it, that is in some meaningful sense its author. And the neuroscience suggests that the situation is considerably more complicated than that. The thought was already happening before you were aware of it, not as speculation, as a measured, reproducible laboratory finding. The neural activity that produces a conscious thought precedes the conscious awareness of that thought by hundreds of milliseconds. By the time you experience yourself thinking, the thought is already there. You didn't generate it, you received it from processes in your own brain that were running without your knowledge or consent. So, where did it come from? That's what we're going to follow. Start with what a thought physically is, because if we're going to ask where thoughts come from, we need to be precise about what we're asking about. The intuitive picture. A thought is a mental thing, immaterial, happening in the mind, distinct from the physical brain in the way software is distinct from hardware. Same system, different kind of thing. The physical reality. A thought is a pattern of electrochemical activity across a network of neurons. Specific neurons fire in specific sequences. Neurotransmitters are released across synaptic gaps and bind to receptors on the receiving neuron. Ion channels open. Electrical potentials propagate along axons. The pattern spreads, activates connected regions, generates further activity. This is not a description of something that causes a thought, or corresponds to a thought, or accompanies a thought. It is, as far as neuroscience can determine, what a thought is in physical terms. The neural activity pattern is not separate from the thought. It is the thought described at the level of physics. The scale of this is worth sitting with for a moment. The brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons. Each neuron has thousands of synaptic connections. The average is roughly 7,000. The total number of synaptic connections in a human brain is approximately 100 trillion. The number of possible states of this network, the number of distinct patterns of activity it could in principle produce, is so large that any number I give you will be misleading by being too small. A thought is a specific trajectory through this state space, a particular pattern of activation propagating through a network of staggering complexity. And that trajectory doesn't appear from nowhere. It emerges from prior states of the same network, modified by sensory input, shaped by everything the network has learned and experienced. The causal question, where does a thought come from, is asking about the origin of a specific electrochemical trajectory through a 100 trillion connections system. The answer is physically real. It is not simple. In 1983, Benjamin Libet conducted an experiment that changed the terms of the debate about conscious agency. Participants were asked to flex their wrist whenever they felt like it, spontaneously. No schedule, no instruction about timing, just whenever the urge arose. They watched the clock and reported the position of the clock hand at the moment they became aware of the intention to move. Electrodes recorded their brain activity throughout. The finding? A slow rise in brain electrical activity, now called the readiness potential, began approximately 550 milliseconds before the movement. The participants' reported moment of conscious intention came approximately 200 milliseconds before the movement. The math. The brain began preparing the movement 350 milliseconds before the person was consciously aware of intending to make it. The decision, as a neural event, measurable, reproducible, preceded the conscious experience of deciding. by more than 1/3 of a second. More recent work has extended this. Using fMRI and pattern recognition algorithms to decode brain states, researchers have shown that the outcome of certain decisions can be predicted from neural activity up to 10 seconds before the person reports making the decision. 10 seconds. The brain is computing the outcome while the person is unaware that a decision is forming. The interpretation of these findings is genuinely contested. Some argue they demonstrate that conscious volition is, in a specific technical sense, an illusion, that decisions are made by neural processes and consciousness observes them after the fact, constructing a narrative of authorship that doesn't reflect causal reality. Others argue that the readiness potential doesn't represent a committed decision and that consciousness retains a veto function, the ability to interrupt a developing action that it didn't initiate. What's not disputed? The conscious experience of deciding does not coincide with the neural events that produce the decision. There is a measurable gap. The thought, or the intention, is already in process before awareness of it begins. If you didn't initiate it, where did it come from? From the rest of the brain, the part you don't have access to. The brain is never idle. In conditions of rest, no task, no particular cognitive demand, a network of brain regions becomes especially active. The medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the angular gyrus, the hippocampus. These regions form what's called the default mode network, and its activity pattern during rest is the opposite of what you might expect. It's not quiet. It's highly organized, energy intensive, and specifically engaged. What is it doing? Processing, integrating. The default mode network is active during mind wandering, during self-referential thought, during retrieval of autobiographical memory, during simulation of possible futures. It's running models of yourself, of social situations, of scenarios that haven't happened yet. This processing occurs largely below the threshold of conscious awareness. The insight experience, the aha moment, the solution that arrives fully formed while you're doing something else, is the most vivid evidence that this background processing is real and productive. You work on a problem, you get stuck, you give up for the day. Hours later, or days later, the solution arrives, while you're showering or walking or at the moment of waking. It arrives with a quality of correctness, a feeling of recognition that turns out to be justified. The processing continued in the absence of conscious attention. The default mode network kept working the problem. When the computation reached a state that crossed some threshold, it surfaced into awareness. Henri Poincaré, the mathematician, described leaving a problem on the theory of Fuchsian functions unresolved, going on a geological excursion, and having the key insight arrive at the precise moment he stepped onto a bus in Coutances, not gradually, suddenly, complete. He writes that he didn't have time to verify it, he simply knew it was right and returned home to confirm it later. Helmholtz reported similar experiences. Gauss, Ramanujan reported receiving mathematical results in dreams. The pattern is too consistent across too many people of established reliability to dismiss. The thought came from somewhere that wasn't conscious deliberation. It came from a brain that was working without announcing itself. The brain is extraordinarily expensive metabolically. 2% of body mass, 20% of the body's energy budget. And that cost is nearly constant. The difference in energy consumption between rest and intense cognitive effort is surprisingly small. The brain is running at near maximum energy consumption almost all the time. What is all that energy for? Primarily, maintaining the electrochemical potential across neuronal membranes. The resting state of a neuron is a maintained imbalance, more positive ions outside, more negative inside. That requires continuous active pumping. This potential is the stored energy that allows the neuron to fire. Maintaining it is expensive.
It's the brain's basic infrastructure cost. But there's a framework that gives a more functional answer to what the brain is doing with that energy. The predictive processing framework, which has become increasingly central to theoretical neuroscience, proposes that the brain's fundamental operation is not passive reception of sensory information.
It is active generation of a model of the world, continuously updated by incoming data to minimize the difference between prediction and reality. The brain generates expectations about what sensory input will arrive, about what actions will produce what outcomes, about what the current state of the environment is, and compares those expectations to actual input. Where they match, no update is needed. Where they differ, the model is revised. In this framework, a thought is not simply a response to external input, it's the predictive model generating internal content, hypotheses, simulations, evaluations, that serves the model updating function. Most of this generative activity never reaches conscious awareness. The fraction that does is the subset that the system has determined, through processes we don't fully understand, to be worth surfacing. The question, where does a thought come from, becomes in this picture, what caused the prediction machine to generate this particular content at this particular moment? The answer involves the current state of the network, shaped by recent experience. The stored patterns of a lifetime of learning, every concept, every association, every emotional response ever encoded. The current sensory context, what the environment is providing right now. And the thermodynamic noise inherent in a biological system, the random fluctuations in neural firing that introduce genuine unpredictability into what is otherwise a deterministic physical process. Thoughts emerge from the physics of a complex system running at the boundary between order and chaos. Structured enough to produce coherent content, noisy enough to produce novelty. The creativity of thought is not separate from its physics. It may be identical to it. Every thought has a causal history. The neural pattern that constitutes this thought was produced by prior neural states. Those were produced by earlier states. Those by earlier states still. Follow it back far enough, and the causal chain reaches your brain's state this morning, shaped by last night's sleep. Last night, shaped by yesterday. Yesterday, shaped by your entire adult history. That history shaped by childhood. Childhood shaped by genetics and early environment. Genetics shaped by the evolutionary history of a species. The environment shaped by physical and cultural processes extending over centuries. A thought that feels spontaneous, arising unbidden, feeling new, has a causal history that extends to before you were born. The specific configuration of the universe that led to this brain in this state at this moment producing this particular pattern is the complete causal answer to where did this thought come from? The question this raises, does that causal chain leave any room for a you as a genuine independent originator? If the thought was the output of prior physical states, states that were themselves determined by states before them, in what sense did you think it? In what sense is it yours, rather than simply the latest event in a causal sequence that has been running since before you existed? Quantum indeterminacy introduces genuine randomness into physical systems, including neural ones. But randomness is not the same as choice. A thought produced by quantum noise is not more yours than a deterministic one. It's less predictable, but no more controlled. Random is not free. The question of whether there is a thinker, a genuine originating agent behind thoughts, is one of the deepest problems in philosophy of mind, and the physical picture does not obviously resolve it. It describes the causal history of thoughts in extraordinary detail. It does not tell us whether in that causal history there is a place where an agent enters. There is something unusual about this particular line of inquiry. The thought that is asking, "Where do thoughts come from?" is itself a thought. It is subject to everything described here. It was preceded by neural preparation. It arose from background processing. It has a causal history that extends to before the person thinking it was born. By the time there was conscious awareness of this question, the question was already forming. And yet, something is following this argument. Something is evaluating it. Something is reading these words and having a reaction, finding them interesting or disagreeing, or noticing something unexpected. That something, the aware, experiencing, reading thing, is not obviously captured by the description of neural patterns and causal chains. This is what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. Not the tractable problems, explaining how the brain processes information, integrates sensory data, generates behavior. Those are technically complex, but approachable in principle with existing frameworks. The hard problem is different. It asks, why is any of this processing accompanied by subjective experience at all? Why is there something it feels like to think, rather than just thinking happening without anyone inside? We can map the neural correlates of consciousness, the brain states that correspond to specific experiences. We cannot explain why those states are accompanied by experience, rather than simply occurring in the dark. Why there is an inside to them, why there is a what it's like. I've spent my career with equations. I trust equations because they can be tested. You derive a prediction, you compare it to measurement, you learn whether you were right. The Dirac equation predicted antimatter before anyone had detected it. The equation knew something the experimenters didn't yet. But I find with this question that the equations describe everything except the thing that's reading them. The neural activity can be measured. The causal history can be traced in principle all the way back. The predictive processing can be modeled. The readiness potential can be recorded. All of this is real, measurable, subject to the methods that have made physics what it is. And somewhere in all of that description, following this argument, having a reaction to it, aware of being aware, there is something that is not in any of the descriptions. Not because it's supernatural, not because it requires anything outside physics, but because the physics we have describes processes from the outside. It describes what neural systems do. It does not describe what it is like to be one. Where does a thought come from? From prior neural states, from background processing in the default mode network, from the thermodynamic noise of a biological prediction machine, from a causal chain that extends unbroken to before you existed. And it arrives in something that experiences it. That something, the experiencer, is the question that every description I've given has walked around without entering. The brain generates thoughts. Something receives them. The gap between those two statements is the most interesting problem there is. Who is thinking this?